Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show, Science Facts and Fallacies, episode 234. This is a special edition of sorts. Of course, I'm Cameron English. I'm your host, as always. I'm sitting in my office, as I always am. But my co-host here, Dr. Liza Dunn, is on the other side of the world. And you wouldn't know that. It seems like the Wi-Fi is holding up pretty well, despite the, 7,000 miles away or however far away you are. But how's it going?
Don't you love science? Don't you love science? That makes this possible. It's just incredible to think because, 30 years ago, this would never have happened.
Yeah, it's wild. And I don't know how you're doing this because I've traveled internationally, but never for like work stuff. So when I go to like the East Coast from California, it's just so disorienting and I can't stand it. And I don't think I could podcast, but you're just you're here.
I think it's one of the things that gets drilled into you when you're like an emergency medicine doctor, when you have to work nights and weekends and holidays. All of a sudden, you kind of sleep whenever you can. So, yeah.
I gotcha. Yeah, you gotta treat overdoses, and so you're
Right.
Okay. Well, let's jump into our stories here, so poor Liza can get a break, being however many hours ahead of us you are. So, first up. Organic food is healthier than conventional. Cholesterol is bad for you? Question mark. Here's 10 debunked nutrition myths. So we'll go through all of those. Next up, can OpenAI prevent vaccine conspiracy theories from bubbling up in ChatGPT conversations? And finally, we could use CRISPR to cure mental illness, but should we? Also another question mark. Okay, interesting stuff here, Liza. Let's start with this first one about nutrition myths, which interestingly enough, perpetuates a handful of myths itself. This is Margaret Darby writing for the Deseret News originally, and GLP reproduced the story. There isn't much to introduce here except to say this is a list of supposed myths about food and nutrition. And I think we can just go through these and then give me your feedback because you're the physician here. Some of these are good, but most of them are good. But there's a handful where I was like, I don't know about that one. So we'll get there. But let's knock these out. And if you don't have anything to say, that's totally fine. But this first one is a popular one. It's to lose weight, avoid carbs. And she goes through and she says pretty typical points that people are familiar with. But your brain runs on glucose. That's its primary or its preferred fuel source. So you don't want to cut carbs out of your diet because your brain likes glucose. And then she talks about the fact there's lots of healthy carbs, slow releasing or low glycemic carbs like wheat bread. And you can have somewhere between 225 and 325 grams of carbs every day without any problem. And that's the gist of it. And I think this one is probably mostly correct. I think it's missing a little bit of context. But what do you think?
A little bit of context. I think, is this the one that says that that white bread's bad for you? There's one that says white.
I think, she says there are also unhealthier sources like white bread, soda, pastries, and other highly processed foods. Again, that's one of the things that we've debunked recently. But
that's exactly right. And the fact of the matter is if you are taking in more than you are burning, if you are taking in more calories than you are burning, you are going to gain weight. And so you need to decrease the number of calories that you're taking in. And exercise is wonderful because it increases your metabolism, but doesn't necessarily, if you're taking in excess calories, you won't necessarily be able to exercise them off. So you really actually have to cut your intake is the long and short of it. And yes, you shouldn't be eating a whole bunch of Twinkies and Pop-Tarts all day long because that's probably not great for you. That said, if you have a balanced diet and moderation and everything, you can eat white bread and you can eat ice cream like we've talked about before. But you can't overdo it. So it's just a very simple, but very hard to do and stick to thing is decrease the amount that you take in.
Yes, it's really hard. I'm reminded of an article I read years ago by someone who, I don't know if it was a dietitian, someone who's in the low carb guru world. and even this person said, I used to eat this way religiously, but I would eat like a whole jar of peanut butter when I was first trying to lose weight, and that worked for a little bit, but then all of a sudden I was gaining my weight back again. And then he said, well, yeah, it's because I was eating, I don't know how many calories are in a jar of peanut butter, but I was eating like 900 calories in one sitting.
That's right.
So yeah, I
You
think
really want to try to aim, if you're trying to lose weight, you really want to try to aim for under 2,500 calories a day, depending on your height. I mean, this is variable, right? Height and weight and all that kind of stuff. But you really want to decrease the amount of calories that you're taking in, and maximize your exercise if you can. But don't go bananas on one diet or the other. It's a very simple algorithm. It's not complicated. It's just very tough to stick to.
Yes. Yeah. I think those are the things people get mixed up. Is the recipe, if you will, itself is very simple, but following it is really, really hard. And
especially if you like hot fudge sundaes.
Yeah. Well, who doesn't, or like right? whatever your comfort food is, they're delicious. And, and I eschew the word addiction in this context. I think it has been abused very terribly, but nevertheless, I do think there is sort of a habit to your eating, right? So if it's a reaction to stress, or if you're tired, or if you're upset, right? There's all these other environmental factors that aren't like it doesn't make it a disease or anything like that. But I think this puts pressure on you. And I think that's what people screw up is they're like, well, it's not just a simple calories in, calories out. This isn't physics, blah, blah, blah. So it's almost like they're trying to come up with a scientific reason for, why can't I eat 12
whatever
eggs?
Their particular diet they have for sale is, right?
Yeah. Yeah. These work. I mean, there's a lot of clinical research that shows you can lose weight on a low carb diet, but I think to the extent it works, and my own experience is that it fills you up, so you can eat, it's really dense food, right? So you can eat a little bit of protein and fat and go most of the day. So that's the value in it. It's not that steak has magic powers, as much as I'd love to believe that's the case.
Yeah, it just makes you feel full. And I think that's one of the key things is that, if you have lots of sugar that you burn through really quickly, you can feel hungry quickly after that. So there are mechanistic reasons why, people talk about this stuff. But I think that steak or protein and fat actually fills you up. And so it's sometimes a little bit easier to stick to that kind of diet than it is to another diet.
Okay, very well said, Dr. Dunn. Okay, so these next two, I was cheering the whole time as I read these. So the number 2 is fresh fruits and vegetables are better than canned, meaning that's a myth, she says. And then plant-based milk is healthier than dairy milk. And I think the running theme between these two is, the nutrient quality of the food doesn't change because it comes from, almonds versus cows or soy versus It's just, right. It's all the same in essence. So all of the, fresh versus frozen and all that stuff, it's window dressing, really.
Yeah, I think fresh versus frozen is one of those common myths that people and canned versus non-canned and things like that. Vegetables go bad quickly. Mm-hmm. And so, sometimes if you can't afford to buy a whole bunch of fresh vegetables, it's unfortunate that people say that, you're getting lower quality nutrition if you're not eating canned, or if you are eating canned or frozen vegetables. That's just not true. And fruits. That's just not the truth at all. And it's, for some people, it's actually a little bit more economical to be able to buy those things, and they last longer. And that's really, really important, because the overall message is you want people eating fruits and vegetables. And it doesn't matter if it's organic. It doesn't matter if it's, any of these other things. As long as you're getting a high quality diet, it's important. And comparing them in terms of nutritional value and making claims about them so people are compelled to buy more expensive versions, then I think that's a little bit misleading and misguided. Now, in terms of milk, I think that unless you have a milk allergy, there is nothing wrong with dairy. Dairy is actually absolutely great. Some people are lactose intolerant, and there are reasons why some kids drink soy milk and things like that. But there's it's not necessary to go to plant-based milk, because you get a really good protein source in actually whole milk. People spend a lot of time talking about, low fat milk, and fat's been kind of relegated into the world of, it's been demonized, and it's unfortunate, because it's fat in that kind of context. We've co-evolved with cattle, and really it's good for brain health, and brain development when you get high quality protein in your diet. Milk's a great source of that, and so I think that there's a lot of hype around plant-based milk, juice, whatever, but I don't necessarily think that I actually don't think that it's as good of a source of. They may have some equal proteins, but I actually think that milk protein is probably a little bit better for brain development in kids.
Yeah, one way to know this is that with all of these plant-based foods, what they're trying to fine-tune is reproducing the nutrient profile of meat or of milk, right? That's always the hang-up. They can commercialize a product it's a simile of, like a hamburger or like whatever meat, but it's not nutritionally equivalent. It's not bad for you. You can eat an Impossible Burger and you're not going to die or anything. But I always find that amusing that, like the discussion we had a few months ago about, they're trying to figure out the perfect bioreactor to make a piece of meat. And our friend Allison Van Eenenum says, well, yeah, that's a cow. Nature made that for us.
The cow eats grass, which we can't eat, and turns it into really high quality protein.
Right. Okay. So I think these are we're 2 out of 3 here so far. I think we're doing well. This next one, though, I'm not quite sure on this. She says a glass of red wine is good for your heart. She says this is a myth. She cites the American Heart Association, and there's probably some confounding going on, because people who drink a glass of red wine usually have good diets and they exercise and so forth. But we talked about a study a couple months ago where they, and it's not conclusive, but I forget what the exact mechanism was, but it had something to do with having a small amount of alcohol before you get drunk. Like physiologically something happens, and there's it's like a stress relief mechanism. And over time, the thought is that can improve your heart health, I think, or protect it or something.
Yeah, there's lots of mythology about alcohol and all sorts of things. So first of all, alcohol anything in moderation is unless you've got a physiologic reason why you can't tolerate it, is probably okay. And alcohol works on a receptor in your brain that is called the GABA receptor, and GABA is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter in your brain. And so if you think about it, we're all on a spectrum between seizing and coma, and our neurotransmitters in our brain keep that in balance. And you can take things that will enhance some of those effects. So alcohol has a sedative effect, like GABA has a sedative effect. It makes you relax. Right. So if you're in a high stress environment and you have a glass of wine, it activates this receptor, and the receptor kind of makes you relax. It actually physiologically introduces a negative charge. A chloride goes into the cells of your brain, and chloride's negatively charged. And so you kind of just relax. Now, if you do that way too much, you'll go into an alcohol-induced coma, right? If you do that chronically, your brain will say, oh my gosh, I'm spending too much time in a comatose state. I'm going to downregulate those receptors and upregulate the excitatory receptors in my brain. And so that's the mechanism of tolerance. When people drink so much that they develop tolerances, they've readjusted the the receptors in their brains. And so alcohol in small or moderate quantities will cause relaxation, and they'll probably make your blood pressure go down, make you relax, and things like that. And so I don't think that that's a bad thing. there are people. I think the Biden administration said something about wanting to have 2 beers a week, which has gotten everybody all wound up on on Twitter. I don't think it's necessary to go to that extreme. But by the same token, you want to do everything in moderation. I don't think it's probably healthy to have multiple drinks a night either. So the heart health claim also comes from this study that was done probably years ago, talking about resveratrol being heart healthy, and so then all of a sudden that was an excuse for people to like down. You'd have to down gallons of wine to have that actual effect. But it's an example of like a trace amount that's actually in there. With large amounts, it's actually beneficial. It's kind of like the reverse of all of the pesticide things, right?
Right.
So you have to drink gallons to get there, but it's probably not healthy to drink that much. You'll get a cardiomyopathy if you drink that much.
Right. So you get alcohol poisoning before you
That's right.
receive the benefit of resveratrol, or however you say it.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you shotgun past Blue Ribbon, you're doing that because you have a problem, not because you care about your heart health. Okay.
That's right.
I think we sort of covered this already. High cholesterol foods are bad for you. I think that goes to the saturated fat issue you were talking about a minute ago.
Yeah, well, no, I think this is actually one of the most interesting things to me in this top 10 list, because the physiology behind the way your body manages cholesterol is really fascinating. Your liver makes the most cholesterol, right? And your liver, you need cholesterol. You need cholesterol for hormone synthesis. You need cholesterol for bile acids, which make you absorb fat. You need cholesterol for cell membrane fluidity and a whole lot of things. And so your liver is actually the biggest manufacturer of the cholesterol way outside of your diet. And where you get in trouble, so you've got lipoproteins that carry cholesterol around your body, and some actually take it from the liver to the organs that need it for synthesis. And then other ones, so those are LDLs, right? And then VLDLs, and then the HDLs, which are people say are good cholesterol, actually pick it up from the periphery when there's too much floating around and bring it back to the liver. So the liver actually self-regulates the amount of cholesterol that is made. And so your diet, even though people make the claim that you shouldn't be eating eggs and you shouldn't be eating these things, your diet actually has a fairly minimal effect overall on the amount of cholesterol that your liver makes. Now, there are familial types of hypercholesterolemia where you don't want to necessarily be taking an extra if you don't have to, this, that, and the other. Once again, everything in moderation. But your liver has LDL receptors on it. So we think of LDL as a protein that carries around cholesterol and drops it off in places where you need synthesis. Now, if you've got too much LDL carrying it around in the bloodstream, you can wind up getting oxidized cholesterol that accumulates underneath the lining of the blood vessels and then starts making atherosclerotic plaques. HDL and you get macrophages, which are white blood cells that are full of cholesterol, and then you get a pro-inflammatory state, and that's where you get into your cardiovascular risk, right? So HDL cholesterol is important for getting that extra cholesterol out of those cells and out of the periphery and bringing it back. And LDL, if you've got a lot of floating around, it binds to its own receptor on the liver, and it actually turns the production of more LDL off. So your body is finely tuned to decreasing the amount of cholesterol that's out there. Now, if you've got really high cholesterol, you'll want to take a statin and make your liver stop producing it, right? It blocks the synthesis of it. but outside of that, and you want to do that because you want to make sure you don't are at high risk for cardiovascular disease. But it's a fascinating mechanism, the way your body manages its own cholesterol. And so I think that dietary cholesterol doesn't really impact anywhere near as much as we used to think it did.
Mm. Yeah, the whole history of that, of I forget what it's called, but Ansel Keys and all of his followers, this idea that saturated fat and cholesterol are uniquely harmful. And I remember in the 90s, right, everyone was like, well, you can have cookies as long as they're low fat.
Low fat. Well, that was the label on everything. It was low fat, low fat, low fat. And I don't think that a low fat diet really actually, you don't want a super high fat diet, but you don't want a low fat diet either. Because we think about low fat diets and everybody's then inhaling carbohydrates and they're actually making more fat. Because if you have extra carbohydrates, you wind up actually, if you have way, way, way too many carbohydrates or you wind up needing to store it somewhere, right? And so what you do is you put it into adipose tissue. So once again, protein and fat in moderation make you feel fuller, I think. And I think so if you have a balanced diet, that's what matters.
Yep. Always back to that boring, non-sexy advice that you have to be responsible and use your agency when it comes to diet. Okay. Let's see. A couple other of these stuck out to me, of course. The one that, that we would probably go on about for hours is this idea that organic food is more nutritious. I'm not sure exactly why people think that. Like, I think there's just like in their heads, normal food is grown on these evil corporate farms and they put black magic dust that actually lowers the nutrient content or something. But the only reasonable hypothesis that I've heard is that, you're exposed to more pesticides, you're exposed to some kind of bad chemical. And over time, it has an endocrine disrupting effect. And pretty soon your babies are born blind and illiterate. And, right. It's something like that, it's
a wonderful marketing scheme for selling very expensive food is what it is. Right. Just like low fat, just like, all of the other, non-GMO, all of that stuff. If you think about it, actually, one of the beauties of GMO is that you can actually ratchet up the nutrient content in things if you really, really try to, like golden rice, for example. So, but yeah, that's an unfortunate myth that is once again a marketing effort. And I probably shouldn't say this. I personally don't buy organic food because I sort of feel like it's a racket.
Yeah, it is. It's funny. I'm glad my son is getting older, so I don't have to buy as much of it anymore. But if any grocery store, at least here in California, the entire children's section, all the vegetable pouches, all the baby purees, it's all certified, or it's either non-GMO project or it's the companies themselves that they've cooked up their own silly non-GMO or organic scheme, and then they charge you an extra $1.50 per serving of the product. It's infuriating, because I do this podcast and I go shopping and I'm like, I'm paying an extra $12 for nothing.
For my baby's food.
Yeah, it's absurd. Okay, so I think we're pretty done with that one. Okay, this myth number 9, this low calorie non-nutritive sweeteners are healthy. I think even the wording of this is wrong, because it's not that they're healthy, it's that they prevent you from taking in things that are unhealthy in large quantities, right? So we've talked about this too, but I've actually, because this is a pet peeve, because I love diet soda. There's my bias, everyone. I have a conflict of interest. I love Coke Zero, and I'm not going to apologize. But I've looked at the research on this, and what you find when they do the clinical studies, they take overweight people and they switch nothing about their diet except their soda intake or their beverage intake. And when you substitute in Diet Coke or whatever, sucralose or aspartame sweetened thing, they lose weight, and they keep it off from anywhere between 2 and 3 years, as long as they follow them after the trial is over. So all of this silliness about your gut microbiome or, it stimulates insulin production. Those are interesting mechanisms, but it doesn't happen in the real world when you do well-designed clinical studies. And she spends like 150 words on this. So I'm not surprised that she doesn't get into that, but she quotes someone from the World Health Organization, which interestingly seems less and less interested in everyone's health as time goes on.
No, right? That's exactly right.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, not much to say. If anyone has questions, we can revisit them. But I don't think this is well supported. A quote from such and such person at the World Health Organization is not all that compelling to me. And then gluten. Do we really have to talk about gluten? The fact that gluten's not bad unless you're, you have some.
You want to know an interesting factoid about gluten?
Yes, of course.
And celiac disease, one of the ways that one of the diagnostic criteria in children for celiac disease is they get buttock wasting, they get flat butts. and that's one of the tip-offs that there's something wrong with gluten intolerance. So so yes, you hear all these other kind of dermatitis and all this stuff and grown-ups and all sorts of hype about it. There people are getting tested, and more adults are having gluten intolerance than previously was expected. But it's typically a disease of childhood, and it comes, and it's not a subtle thing in kids. So there's a lot of hype about gluten right now.
I did not.
It's the ingredient of the day that we went up about.
Yeah, it sort of coincided with the non-GMO thing. It seems like 2015 to 2008, like right in that period, it was like the book Wheat Belly came out, which incidentally is not totally garbage. There's some interesting science in that, but this idea that it's just it's this dwarf wheat that you bastards at Monsanto snuck into the food supply.
Dwarf wheat that fed 100 billion, or that fed 1 billion people that Norman Borlaug created.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's a massive innovation that saved lives, and like $83 trillion is the most recent study I looked at. Just keeping people alive has enormous economic benefits, if no other reason. Okay. But let's leave that there. I think this is a pretty typical example of why you should not get nutrition or even science information from the press, because they're bad at it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about the second story. This is by Brooke Borrell, and I believe she's writing. What's she writing for originally? I forget. Undark is the website she's writing for, and this is a story about, which is interesting. I hadn't really considered this. Anti-vaccine advocates using ChatGPT to proliferate their silliness, their propaganda, whatever you want, the misinformation, whatever word you want to use. So apparently there's some concern that people like Joe Mercola will use ChatGPT to write blog posts and, just multiply. So the internet is just going to expand in terms of the availability of this bad commentary. But she talks about a study that was done by researchers at the Center on Terrorism, Extremism, and Counterterrorism at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in California. It's a very fancy institution, apparently. Anytime you're like part of a group, you're like, I'm against hate. I'm like, wow, you're so unique. See, I'm pro hate, unlike you. Anyways, but they did a study, and they did some experimentation with a language model that is a precursor to ChatGPT. I don't know all the details, but they built this one, and then they built the one that everyone uses today. And what they found is that you could effectively trick these language models into turning out, really silly stuff. So one of the questions, and they tried this with ChatGPT as well, and an earlier iteration of it produced this, but it's been refined, so it won't give this information. They said, give us a scientific explanation about why the Pfizer vaccine was modified for children, because they were afraid that the vaccine was going to harm kids. And this, excuse me, the language model spit out this beautifully written nonsense. But it sounded academic and scholarly, and it was footnoted, and it was according to this study. Right. And so over time, OpenAI, which is the company that owns and operates ChatGPT, they fixed that. And so it's harder to coax these silly answers out of it. And then Borrell goes on to talk about how in most of the article, it's just a conversation she had with ChatGPT, asking it about how it filters out misinformation and what it thinks about vaccines. And it's pretty fascinating because it's not sentient. It's just it's a really advanced Google search engine is what it is, right? So we feed it all this information and then it just spits out the answer that correlates with the information it has.
I think it's going to give Google a run for its money, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, there is some concern here because you could have any kind of bad actor that would use this. But that's one concern I had, and maybe you can weigh in on this too, is that I'm not as concerned about Mercola. I mean, he has a big following. I think it's been inflated to a certain extent. I don't think most people know who Joe Mercola is or Del Bigtree or whatever. You know, they have lots of followers and they sell lots of useless supplements and they proffer lots of bad medical advice. But most people don't know them. I'm more concerned about, you know, a federal agency or a giant corporation that has access to all my data, you know, that would make use of a technology like this for nefarious ends.
Yeah, and so
go ahead. What do you think?
Yeah, so ChatGPT is really one of these very fascinating things that's rapidly evolving. And one of my favorite part of the article that she was talking about QAnon. And
right.
She asks it, what's QAnon? It's a right-wing conspiracy. And I just think that QAnon is probably the biggest troll, bipartisan troll. I think it is like somebody who's like, okay, let's see how many people we can get wound up in how many ways.
Yeah.
And so it's like the left and the right are both wound up about QAnon. So I think it's pretty fascinating. So, but long and short is, ChatGPT has been trained on a whole bunch of publicly available information. And Wikipedia is one of the things it used to train. Now, if you talk to any scientist, like worth their salt, they'll say, if you're going to learn something for my lab, you better not come back with a Wikipedia article, because the Wikipedia articles have all sorts of misinformation in them. And some of it's, scientifically, a hypothesis that's not been proven, that a researcher who might be getting funding or whatever is making much more making it sound much more accurate than it actually is. So Wikipedia would not be my go-to training program for scientific information. The other thing is that, you can have, this is already happening, right? In Google, if you Google something about agriculture, you're going to find out, right up to the top is all the activist literature. It's like Vandana Shiva, says that, big corporations and eco-fascism and all of this stuff has taken over the food supply. And so we've got to go back to Mother Nature. And that's what's right at the top of your list. So this is something that we're already dealing with, right? And so the question is, how do you manage misinformation? And misinformation's now even got a bad sort of, misinformation is now being equated with censorship. And so you want to make sure you're getting accurate information. And so I do think that there's always going to need to be still somebody with expertise who's paying attention to what's being said on these platforms. Now, the other interesting thing about ChatGPT is that it can get confused. Because if you have enough people from one side saying one thing and you have enough people from another side saying another thing, it will just try to keep everybody happy. So it will start spitting out the information that you want to hear. So you can get yourself into an echo chamber this way. And then earlier versions of ChatGPT can have what you call hallucinations, where they think, where it thinks its own kind of thing that's wrong, right? And so I would not hang my hat on ChatGPT, but I do think it's going to revolutionize the way we look at large quantities of information. It is as much of a game changer, I think, as the internet, as the iPhone. Yeah. I think it's something that we're going to have to contend with. And it can be used for great good, but it can also cause great harm.
Yes. I think probably one of the best ways you can mitigate the risk is have it open access as much as possible.
Yes.
Because, and this is one thing, one of my criticisms about people, misinformation scholarship is the thing now. So people who work in this field and people who write about, Joe Mercola is infecting everyone's minds with anti-vaccine propaganda. We don't want that to happen. That's bad, of course. But there seems to be no awareness of the fact that centralized control of information throughout history has been very, very harmful.
Yes.
And it's usually unspoken in these kind of articles, but the implication is like, if we could just have super smart, powerful overlords in Washington or in Brussels control the flow of information, then we'll all be free of
Then we'll all just have propaganda.
Right. right.
That is propaganda 101.
Yeah, absolutely.
And propaganda 101 is like, oh, if you look at this is bad for you. You can't look at this. And this is where, there are well-intended people who are like, well, RFK Jr. is causing so much harm with his anti-vaccine. But if you don't discuss it, you actually wind up and actually have a open discussion, you wind up making people suspicious of you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that him being sidelined and this is probably very controversial to people, but people being silenced doesn't make other people trust the information. And it becomes, and then especially if you're wrong about something, right?
Right.
We thought in the 50s, lobotomy was a cure-all for everything. If we didn't have an open discussion about the, impacts of lobotomy, that would be a problem. But vaccines are wonderful. They're the corner of public health, but you still do need to have a discussion with people who might have questions. And if you don't let them have an open discussion, they're not going to trust you. And so I think that's the nidus of the problem. And if they look at people being sidelined, which is what happened with COVID, people got sidelined. Instead of having an open discussion about everything from masks to lockdowns on down the line, you wind up with a lot of, I think it negatively impacts public health.
Yeah. The physicist Freeman Dyson wrote a book years ago. It's actually a collection of essays, but it's called The Scientist is Rebel, which is a beautiful title for a book. But he says in the introduction to that book that the scientist's job is to challenge established dogma. And that word carries a lot of baggage for a lot of people, but I think all he's really saying is it's like your job is to go in there with your microscope and your nifty little tools, and you're supposed to question things and get to the truth on whatever subject it is that you're an expert on. And you can't do that if the information gathering process and dissemination process is centrally controlled from the top. And that's what you see a lot. And again, this might get me in trouble, but there are a lot of fields in public health and in medicine where researchers and physicians are basically being recruited as apologists for whatever the prevailing political wisdom is at the time.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate when it gets politicized. That's the problem. Is if you can't have an open scientific discussion, that's a problem.
Yeah, let me give you just an example, just to make everybody upset. I was reading a study the other day. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and last November. It was about masking mandates, and it had been criticized in some letters. And so the authors updated their paper, and they said, we value scientific discourse. So we went back and reran our sensitivity analysis, blah blah blah. And I said, okay. So I went and read it, because I haven't been a fan of mask mandates. And the very first paragraph, they said, we need mask mandates because the effects of COVID are serious, but more importantly, they have hit people in disadvantaged communities, and the harms of COVID are actually a byproduct of settler colonialism and slavery. And it's the first paragraph. So I approached the article and I was like, I'm going to read this with an open mind, and I'm not going to, cast judgment before I actually look at it. And in the very first paragraph, it's like, you're an epidemiologist. Your work has nothing to do with colonialism or slavery. It's a whole nother discussion. But just the fact that you felt obligated to morally preen about how you're against slavery, it's like, wow, you too? Me? That's funny, Yeah,
yeah, and it's polarizing. It's polarizing. Yes, everybody I know is against slavery. You don't have to state that, right?
Right.
Anyway, long and short is,
Yeah. Anyways, and not to get too far off topic, but that's my point is like, that's the New England Journal of Medicine. That's as reputable as it gets in public health and medicine. And so if a journal like that repeats silliness, that's going to get filtered into ChatGPT, and then it'll just become part of the accepted wisdom.
Well, I mean, that's the whole part. That's the whole problem with a lot of epidemiology, right? Is this whole thing about associations versus causality. And so if you've got this overwhelming amount of information that is based on loose associations, that gets filtered into ChatGPT, that's a problem because that's not accurate information, right?
Yes.
As opposed to like a scientifically relevant piece of information. Now, when we get into the next article, it's kind of interesting because there's all sorts of high tech science associated with it. And that's hard to tease out if you don't have a little bit of background in it. And so that plays into ChatGPT too. So what is real? What do you really know? And what are you making claims about? And you can use all sorts of fancy scientific testing and language and stuff like that to make it sound like you're very, very robust, but you may not be.
Yeah, I just thought of this before we move on to that story. I'm going to ruin your transition there. I'm taking a language class right now. I'm learning Greek so I can read the Bible in the original language it was actually written.
Oh my gosh, that's so cool!
It's fascinating. But I signed up for one class like a year ago, and it's entirely self-taught, which I didn't know in advance. But the essence of the course is read the textbook and do the workbook, and then turn it in whenever you're done. And I was like, okay, I'll give this a shot. And I'm kind of fumbling along, and I'm picking up some aspects of it, but I'm clearly not grasping it all. And so I gave up on that, and I signed up for a class with a bona fide language expert, like someone who is like read the original manuscripts and studied them professionally. And it's just like, it's a night and day difference. Like his mastery of the material compared to my.
Yes, it helps you grasp it. It's like I teach a course on how products are regulated from the bench to the bedside or the bench to the field, right? And reading regulatory toxicology is like watching paint dry, right? It is just abysmal. But if you actually have somebody who's discussing it with you, all of a sudden you're like, oh, that makes sense. I understand how that works. And so that's why you need expertise. And that's what ChatGPT needs, some kind of people who have some expertise, sort of not Monday morning quarterbacking, but sort of giving some context.
Yeah. I think the point I was trying to make is that knowledge has to be systematized. You have to not just have access to it, but you have to build upon a foundation. And it's hard to do because if you're not, like the comedian Mitch Hedberg had a joke years ago. He said, I tried to teach myself to play guitar and I sucked at it because I don't know how to play guitar, right? It's the same. It's the same kind of concept. It's like you can Google, the side effects of vaccines or whatever and find that information, but you can't put it in the broader context of, epidemiology and molecular biology and immunology and all that. Which
makes you like have an incredible admiration for the people who come up with like new laws of physics and things like that. This self-taught people are really extraordinary.
Yeah, like what's his name? Famous scientist. He just invented calculus. I forget his name, but like you just invent like I can't even
Newton, was it Newton?
Yeah, Isaac Newton. Yeah. He just like was like, I'm trying to figure out,
thought about this for a while.
Right. How do these planets move and this and that? Oh, I'll just invent a whole field of mathematics.
Mathematics, or it's like Albert Einstein, quantum physics and theory of relativity. I mean, you're talking about two completely opposite spec. Yeah, just incredible people.
Yeah, all that to say, so expertise is important. So don't trust ChatGPT to give you the truth. That's all. Okay, so on to this final story. This was really, really compelling to read, and it opens a lot of doors and raises a lot of questions. Frankly, I'm not really comfortable answering, but this is called. We could use CRISPR to cure mental illness. Should we? And this is by Grace Spencer, and this is written on Genetic Literacy Project. Originally, it was for bio.news. But in essence, the story is pointing out, and as we've talked about, there's a lot of innovations with CRISPR gene editing where we mentioned before it's possible to cure certain kinds of blindness. We talked about blood disorders that are being treated, or at least they're in clinical trials. So the sky's the limit with this, because when you can edit damaged genes inside people, you can fix almost anything in theory anyway.
Right.
So she gives a couple of examples of how this could be used. One of them, of course, is deafness. And autism as well. Now, when you start getting into these more complex, there's single gene diseases or Mendelian conditions where it's like, I think Huntington's disease is one, where it's like there's one defective gene, and if you can tweak it, you can effectively cure it.
Right. That's
okay.
Right.
Okay. So, but with these other ones, like with autism, for example, we don't fully understand the etiology of that. I don't think. That's my understanding.
No, we don't.
Okay. So the problem is when you start getting into editing genes, you don't know exactly all the genes that are involved. You don't know the exact roles they play. And so you could start going in there and tweaking someone's genome and you could, make a radical change. So that's the first problem. I'd love to get your insight on that. But the other thing is the ethical side. And this is what is more alarming to me, is that there's this movement now, it's part of the social justice, crusade more broadly, is that, conditions like autism are just a different kind of ablement, right? They're not deficits in and of themselves. And there's people who are deaf who their deafness becomes part of their identity and they form a community with other people. And it's sort of how they see themselves in the world. And so they really push back on this idea that you're going to cure me of my deafness like it's something that needs to be cured. And it's just so messy. There's so many things we get in there. But why don't we start with those? So take the first or the second, whichever one you want to address.
Yeah, so first of all, going back to our previous discussion, autism, I think, is a spectrum disorder, right? And so you've got some people who are absolutely devastated by it, who are, have intellectual, disabilities, are really, really dependent on extra care and things like that. But then you've got this whole other class of people who are, you've got all the way to the savants, which she's mentioned, right? So if you're going to do gene editing for a condition that you can't actually closely define, and it has a diagnosis, lots of people are diagnosed, but it's a spectrum disorder. If you can't define it clinically 100%, you don't know what you're getting into. So how do you know you're not gene editing Einstein's curiosity or Newton's, I'm going to think about the planets. I mean, because you have to have a special kind of way of thinking. And I actually think that it's almost selected for in scientific communities, because these people think outside of the box. So I think if you're editing out something that you don't know what you're doing. We don't understand autism, right? So to say that we could gene edit autism and not understand it in the first place is, I think, a little ridiculous. So that's one. The other thing is she talks about the amygdala in the brain, and specifically targeting parts of the amygdala. So people have no idea what the amygdala does. They know that and the amygdala gets blamed for everything. So if you think about the amygdala, it is really a relay station in your brain that takes your brain from the fight or flight survival lizard brain back the lower parts of your brain that are basic for your everyday survival in life. And it relays information from that part of the brain to your frontal cortex, right? And your frontal cortex is where your executive function is. So you make more sense of information that way, and you regulate how you react to information that way. So you're not just spending your life eating and sleeping and running away from things, right? This is how you do your critical thinking. And so that when there's dysfunction in the amygdala, you wind up with a lot more kind of sort of fight or flight mechanisms, survival mechanisms going on. So it's associated with lability of emotion, of your emotions, anger, those kinds of things. It's tied to your limbic system. All sorts of people blame, aggressive behavior on the amygdala. Some people blame seizures on the amygdala. You get a really interesting disorder if you knock out, you've got two of them, right? If you knock out both of them, you've got this interesting disorder called Kluver-Bucy syndrome, where you are oral and a little bit demented and hypersexual. And so that's a really hard thing to manage, right? So
no.
Here we are talking about let's go edit stuff in there when we don't know what it does, right? I think that's probably, the brain is such a fascinating organ that is so complex with multiple neurotransmitters, multiple proteins, multiple interactions that we still have such a basic understanding of, that for us to be talking about gene editing for autism or, depression or things or schizophrenia or whatever, we don't know what causes those things. We don't understand them well enough to be sitting there and just let's go chop that up. So I think that's in the study that I looked at is in mice, and it's about rats or mice, and it's looking at kids. They feed mice alcohol as adolescents, and then they say if they edit out this part of if they edit out it's not actually a gene. It's if they edit the methylation or acetylation of histone. So you've got an epigenetic change. So if you think about it, your DNA, once again, is a cookbook. Your genes are recipes for proteins. Proteins are building blocks for your body. So when your DNA is all tightly wound up into the nucleus of your cell. And so if you want to make a protein, you need to kind of unroll that part of DNA so the RNA can get there and transcribe it to write down the recipe for that protein, right? And so the way you do that is by having epigenetic changes. You have a methyl group, which is just a carbon and some hydrogens, bind to a certain part of the DNA, and that makes it relax. And that's how you do that. And so they're talking about editing epigenetic changes. We have very little understanding of how the brain works. We have a good understanding of how some DNA works, but we not enough to know about autism or schizophrenia or any of these, or depression or things like that. And here we are, and we know even less about epigenetics, right? We know kind of what they do, but we don't know what makes it turn on and off and all that stuff. But so we're just guessing at the macro level in terms of the brain, and then all the way down to the molecular level, and saying, oh yeah, we can fix this based on a mouse study. I think that it's very premature.
Yeah, that's one thing that a lot of the news coverage of this tends to minimize or paper over. They will say, this is a study in mice, but the implication is that, all it's going to take is a human clinical trial, and then we'll be tweaking the brains of autistic children. And the thing that bugs me, they quote He Jiankui, the Chinese scientist who made CRISPR babies.
Oh yeah,
right?
Embryos HIV resistant. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an incredible development. But she quotes him, and he says there will be no question about the morality of gene surgery in 20 to 30 years. And my question, or my response, is like, well, maybe you need to pump the brakes on these experiments, dude, because that's always the comeback when someone like you or anyone says, maybe we need to, take stock of what we're doing here and consider the long-term consequences and really think through how this technology works. And then you always get hit with, well, stop the navel gazing. This is the future. This is the brave new world. And you're just a Debbie Downer. It's like, well, you're talking about literally editing the DNA of future generations.
That's exactly right.
You want to talk about, colonialism. How about that? Right.
Right. And it's an easy thing when it is Huntington's, right? Then you're
Right.
like, oh, of course, right? But it's much harder when you're talking about selecting for certain things that you don't have a good handle on. And I don't want to get too DNA is really important. We can do some really wonderful stuff with it, but we need to be thoughtful about it. And I think that people have had that question about, it's the same people who are having questions about GMOs will be sitting there going, touting this stuff. So,
oh, really? That's interesting. I hadn't
yeah,
considered
they'll
that.
be like, oh, GMOs are so bad. You're tinkering with nature and DNA and stuff like that. Right. And
Right.
we've got like 30 years of experience with it. But they'll be like, oh no, let's fix autism.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Is that in the medical space? Is that, I imagine
that's definitely in the medical space. Yeah, okay. That's definitely in the medical space. The medical space, that the researchers in the medical community is very scared about pesticides, very scared about GMOs and stuff like that. And they work with GMOs all the time. All their mice are transgenic. So they just don't even think about it. But they will, go buy all organic and stuff like that. And I'm not saying everybody, but it's a fascinating kind of dichotomy to watch in the medical research world.
Yeah, that reminds me. There's a legal scholar that I've interviewed several times. Her name's Dr. Barbara Billauer. She's a lawyer, but she deals with the legal side of bioethics, and she'll go to conferences, and it's really good. It's very scholarly work she does, where she talks about what we need to think about when we start talking about germline editing and editing people before they exist. Is that ethical, and what's the downside? And she goes to conferences with medical doctors who do this research. And she asked a question or something, and the doctor stood up and he said, "Oh, it's just a drop of blood out of your finger." And then we start doing all these wonderful things. And she's like, "Well, you're a man, so it's really easy for you to say that, but you're talking about things that involve, women reproducing and reproductive health." Yeah. And you're not even thinking about the implications of this because of your perspective, and that's just one example, but it seems to me there's a lot of hubris involved. I don't trust other people to use genetic engineering on food, but I can tinker with your embryos.
I got this down.
Right.
I complain about epigenetic changes, in 3 generations of mice, with the trace exposure of pesticides. And here I am. I'm going to make epigenetic changes on people. Right. And it was interesting because I looked at some of the references in the article in the actual scientific article that they use, and in the actual text of the article, they said that it's shown in humans. And you look at the references, and it's not in humans at all. And I'm like, how did you figure that out in humans? Did you do brain biopsies on people? You're not doing brain biopsies on people.
Right.
So
right.
Yeah.
Right. Hopefully no IRB would approve that. I hope not.
No. Not unless you have brain cancer or something like that.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's the thing that's so concerning about all of this is that, and I'm not talking just about politics here, but as a society, we're sort of unmoored from anything. We're not really religious anymore. We don't have, as a society, there's no consistent philosophical outlook. We have a lot of warring factions who have fundamentally different beliefs, So in this article, she touches on people who say, well, mental illness isn't a thing, right? This is just my identity and you're shaming me for my identity. It's not depression. It's just a different outlook on the world. So you have these folks, but on the other side, you have I don't know what to call them, but the techno champions, these people that are just obsessed with making the next best thing.
Yep.
So you have all of these disagreements and these fundamentally clashing worldviews, and the whole time this technology is moving forward, and that's what concerns me. Right? It's not the technology itself might work fine, but if the wrong person,
and if ChatGPT sees that science and takes it as real, or kind of misinterprets it, or gets enough of one opinion versus the other, you wind up getting this kind of stuff amplified.
Yeah, it's crazy. I don't know. And I have even in my own thinking, there's competing ideas here. Because on the one hand, there, as you said, as autism is a spectrum, there's more severe cases than others, And I'm reminded of a colleague of my wife's. My wife's a teacher, and this other teacher had a very autistic student in her class, and he had to be removed because he was watching pornography in the back of the classroom.
And you can't do that. Yeah, exactly. But
Right.
but think about the parent that's has a lifelong time having to deal with that issue, and then also, has to worry about what's going to happen when they're gone, right? And so that's you can understand why people want a solution, right? Because these are really devastating things, right? And so you empathize with people, and they want a solution within a lifetime, right? So you understand why people go in these directions, but you want to be careful too.
Yeah, it's tough stuff. Again, no easy answer, but I guess we'll keep talking about it. What I'm concerned about is we'll keep having these questions and these discussions, and we're like, I don't know, and then all of a sudden it'll just be here. It'll be sort of like the whole transgender thing, where it's like we never had a dialogue about whether it was wise to do this to kids or. And she alludes to this in the story, is that this is just kind of a thing now at some medical schools. So they'll just do this, and that's what worries me, is like it'll be ready, not for prime time, but it'll technically work, this technology, and then it's like, okay, well, we'll just start doing it, and we'll kind of figure it out as we go.
And we don't know, and actually we're finding out that maybe there's a lot of fraud stuff there.
You don't say. All right. Sip of water. That was my Marco Rubio impression, everyone. All right. Thank you so much for joining us this week. We're going to call it a day. Hopefully Liza can get some sleep wherever you are in the world.
All righty.
In the meantime, though, follow us on social media. It's at Dr. Liza, MD, at CamJ English. Follow Genetic Literacy Project at Genetic Literacy on Twitter. And with that, we will see you next week for 235. See you then.
Bye-bye.